We're so happy to have you here. I think we'll go ahead and get started to make sure that we have enough time for everything today. I'd like to introduce myself first. I'm Denise Blair. I'm the Director of Education at the Michigan State University Museum. And today we are happy to have Curator Dr. Julian Chambliss with us, who will discuss the exhibition Beyond the Black Panther, Visions of Afrofuturism in American Comics. And this exhibition is now open at the MSU Museum website with multiple ways that you can explore that. So I will go ahead and put the address in the chat so that you can look at the exhibit if you would like and share that with others, definitely, if you have the opportunity. And now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Julian C. Chambliss, who is the Val Berryman Curator of History at the Michigan State University Museum and Professor of English with a joint appointment in history at MSU. In addition, he is core participant in MSU's College of Arts and Letters CEDAR project, the Consortium for Critical Diversity in a Digital Age Research. His research interests focus on race, identity, and power in real and imagined urban spaces. As an interdisciplinary scholar, he has designed museum exhibitions, curated art shows, and created public digital history projects that trace community, identity, and power in the American South. Dr. Chambliss will take questions at the end of the session today. And just as a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded. And we thank you so much for joining us. So Dr. Chambliss, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, set my timer here so I don't drone on and on. I appreciate the opportunity, of course, to talk about Beyond the Black Panther, our exhibit at MSU Museum. Always the goal, of course, with these talks is to try to make clear some of the themes that are associated with the show. And so today I'm going to talk about the theme of community that I see as one of the sort of bedrocks of Afrofuturism, and sort of think a little bit about that, how it relates to questions of politics, activism, and visual culture, and how that sort of factors into some of the decisions that led to the comics we have in the show. So I think one of the things very important to think about in this context is this question of counterfutures and alternate lives. As I've talked about in previous iterations of my Curator talks about the show, this show is predicated on the idea of the sort of origin point connected to Afrofuturism and comics. Very famously, of course, Mark Derry essay that sort of defines the term Afrofuturism for many people, uses comics as one of the source material, one of the examples of sort of Afrofuturist thinking. But as the sort of intellectual movement around Afrofuturism developed, comics sort of fell by the wayside. And of course, that makes sense if we think about comics as a broader cultural narrative in the United States that's associated with a juvenile space and not the sort of legitimacy afforded other kind of artistic expressions. So when we think about Afrofuturism in other artistic spheres, such as music or literary spheres, it's much clearer that something is Afrofuturistic, and it's also much more easily accepted in terms of like the cultural narrative associated with it. But with this show, we sort of returned to comics and made an argument that, in fact, comics do produce Afrofuturist narratives. And so there's an important sort of question here about the nature of what Afrofuturism is doing and its connections to these questions of community. And again, because I think the sort of literary legacy associated with Afrofuturism in the American context is very clear, I want to start out this discussion by talking about Octavia Butler, because in part, she is an example of the sort of transformation associated with Afrofuturism, both in terms of her placement in the canon, but also her accomplishments as an artist. So Butler, of course, is one of the literary figures that's often associated with Afrofuturism. Now, it's important to recognize that in the broader narrative of science fiction as a cultural product, that genre of science fiction has, in the 20th century, been more on the margins, and the sort of literary idea that a writer that writes science fiction is doing great literary work is one that has taken time to evolve and be established and take hold. It's not to say that science fiction grandmasters like Samuel Delany or Octavia Butler or contemporary figures like N.K. Jemisin or Nilo Hopkins aren't great writers. It's just simply the way that the literary landscape judges people who are writing science fiction and fantasy has for many years been quite different. That was a fringe literary genre. And Octavia Butler, not just simply as a founding figure in terms of Afrofuturism as a writer, but also a founding figure in terms of legitimizing the science fiction writer as a literary actor, is an important figure. She won a MacArthur Award. Her works are often seen as very complicated explorations of race, gender, and power in the American experience. And she herself talked about a lot of her work was predicated on trying to understand the human contradiction, what she described as human contradiction, this belief that intelligence and hierarchical behavior cannot coexist. So if you read her work as a sort of like body of work, she's often concerned with this contradiction. How can people be intelligent and evolve, but still hold on to ideas around hierarchy and control? Those can't exist. Something's going to happen. This system's going to break. And at some level, many of her works are exploration of like how that system breaks and what are the beliefs, structure, and actions that are necessary to create a system that is not hierarchical, but intelligent and reactive and positive, right? So as a figure, Octavia Butler really gets at a question of community because she's concerned with this question of hierarchy and this question of exploitation. And all at some level of her protagonists are Black women. That's a bold statement, and I always warn students about saying all, but to my mind, 95% of them are Black women. So how does this connect to the sort of like some of these formulations, these theoretical constructs around Afrofuturism that plague me? Plague is a really strong word, but they're always in the back of my head. So I've shown this slide before, and I often go back to it because Kojo Oshun is, of course, a really great thinker when it comes to Afrofuturism. He talks about Afrofuturism as a program for the recovering the history of counterfutures, right? And it's critical work connected to the idea of manufacturing tools for intervention in the current political dispensation, right? So Kojo Oshun this quote always points me to think about Afrofuturism is a tool for transformation that is, of course, predicated on the moment that you're in, right? And this idea of Afrofuturism is a malleable system of addressing questions and problems that people are facing right now is important. And I think it's important for us to think about the legacy of Black speculative practice on our conception of community. And I say legacy because, of course, one of the things about Afrofuturism that if you come to some of these talks in the past, I'll say again, as many people says, Afrofuturism isn't just simply about the past. It isn't just simply about the future. It's also about the past. So it's the past, the present, and the future. They're all contending in an Afrofuturist framework, right? So what does that mean? Well, I made the point before, and I'll make it again, that if you think about the presence of African Americans in the American experience, their speculative vision around freedom has been very important to how we understand what freedom means in the American context. And we can point to the very beginning of like the quote unquote American experiment to see this. This is a sort of historical moment very early in the revolutionary period. The natural and inalienable rights of freedom, which is a series of petitions made by slaves to the Massachusetts legislature in 1777. And these slaves are raising issues about equality and human rights as Americans, the revolutionary forefathers, are talking about, oh, we want to create a country that is predicated on ideas of liberty and equality. And they're going, well, that's a little bit of a contradiction because we're slaves. Shouldn't you be thinking about us? And this is important because it introduces a whole series of conversations and actions related to gradual emancipation that helps to clarify and transform the North into the place that it will be by the time we get to the 19th century. So, there's a fallacy to say there was no slavery in the North in American history. Of course, there was slavery. Slave labor is very important, But there are crucial moments where African Americans are, especially in this sort of early period, pushing for freedom. And this really changes the conversation and introduces things like gradual emancipation. So when you think about the legacy of this is one of the ways that African American vision of freedom, their speculation in the public sphere becomes very important to the broader American experience. So these ideas that that Black imagination is a challenge to questions of hegemony and ideology, that there's a commitment to social justice in the Black imagination, that there's a role for experiential knowledge and storytelling, kind of storytelling, and that there's a perspective that brings together both art, science, culture. These are all part and parcel of like a critical race theory framework. Like one of the ways that we can think about Afrofuturism sort of being epistemology is that it employs all of these things in its various manifestations: this challenge to hegemony, this challenge to ideology, this commitment to social justice, this role of knowledge creation through storytelling and counter storytelling. These are all important parts of Afrofuturism as a practice. So how can we trace this idea of community and activism related to African American and Black speculative practice? Well, we don't have to look very hard, I argue, to see it. Even after that period in the foundation of the country, the sort of early revolutionary period in the 19th century, antebellum period, narratives from slaves, escaped slaves, fugitive slave narratives are an important sort of Black practice that is at some level both a documentary practice, but also a speculative practice. And the reason I say it's speculative is that these narratives become part and parcel of a counter storytelling practice associated with abolition and anti-slavery dialogue that is arguing for the end of slavery and the position and the creation of a more equitable society. So Black people telling their stories, storytelling in the public square through fugitive slave narratives are an important part of the creation of an anti-slavery landscape, right? And probably the most important person in this landscape, of course, is Frederick Douglass. And you're going to see a few clips from the Civil War with the famous documentary by Ken Burns, in part because I think it's an accessible sort of historical document, a very classic documentary. But also I want to call attention to the nature of the storytelling in this narrative as we go through. So hopefully this will work.
And Frederick Douglass, the son of a slave and a white man.
I appear this evening as a thief and robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with them.
Douglass was so eloquent that skeptics charged he could never have been a slave. In part to prove them wrong, he wrote an autobiography, purchased his freedom with $600 obtained from English admirers, and returned to the struggle.
So that little clip from the Civil War, episode 1, The Causes, calls our attention to how Frederick Douglass, as a figure during the run-up to the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War, as an advocate for the end of slavery. And his life story, the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, is a canonical document in our sort of lit canon. You know, we still read the narrative of Frederick Douglass in high school and probably in college too, in a lot of places around the country. And it's important to recognize as that great narration from, oh my gosh, a historian whose name I can't remember right now, but Douglass was not believed at some level by a sort of general public, in part because he was too eloquent, right? His writing was too eloquent and too lucid and too compelling. It was too fantastic for white people to believe he was a slave. And the sort of fantastical nature, the idea that a Black intellectual narrative, a narrative about a Black life is disruptive to the nature and form and understanding of white conceptions of reality, is an idea that I think is something we can consider as Afrofuturist, right? Like he's he's doing this work of telling his story, and that in itself is a challenge.
And Frederick Douglass.
The challenge here is that narrative, that sort of Black narrative, often gets subsumed in our public understanding, right? And so I want to show you another little clip here to sort of emphasize what I'm talking about.
Now events accelerated. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Its portrayal of slavery's cruelty moved readers as nothing else had. Queen Victoria wept over it, and within a year, more than 1.5 million copies were in print worldwide.
So I always love to show little clips of this when I'm teaching for many years African American history class, because this little narration is really interesting because it points to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, one of those texts that is a very important sort of canonical text as a transformative text that is one of the things that drives us into the Civil War, right? It's one of the things that drives to the Civil War. And in part, it's often important to recognize that it is white fears and white visions about slavery that are driving the Civil War. And there's a certain kind of erasure in terms of Black liberatory practice in the way we tell the story of the coming of the Civil War and the story of abolition. Like we sort of go yes, those Black people were there, but really it's people like Harriet Beecher Stowe who makes Black slaves characters in a narrative about white sort of moral redemption. This is the thing that really sort of drives the creation of the sort of post-war or sort of abolition, antebellum slavery that gets you to the Civil War. Now, of course, we can think about this and we can recognize this, and I think in contemporary landscape is very, very problematic. But it's important to recognize that at the time it was very problematic, right? There were figures that we might very much associate with Afrofuturism who are yeah, I'm not in favor of this. Martin R. Delaney is a prime example of this. When we think about Delaney as a historical figure, he's an abolitionist, he's a writer, he's an editor, he's a doctor, he's a politician. He was a contemporary to Frederick Douglass. He worked with him on the North Star. He was one of the first African Americans to write a sort of manifesto about immigration, that is, Black people leaving the United States. He's often seen as a sort of father of a kind of Black nationalist thought, but he's also a person who, especially in this period in the latter part of the 1850s, as many of the things that are the march towards the Civil War are laying themselves out, he was not a huge fan of the rhetoric of abolition that removes Black agency. And his response to that is, of course, his own activism. It's the work that he did in terms of thinking about can Black people leave? But his response was also the creation of texts like Blake, which is a novel that was serialized in the Anglo-African in the late 1850s. And this tells the story of a slave who goes by the moniker Henry Blake, who escapes and travels throughout the southern United States and to Cuba in the effort to plan a large-scale slave insurrection. So right away, what we should think about is not just simply that this plot is somewhat speculative, somewhat fantastic, given the context in which it's being written in the late 1850s, like 1856, 57, 58, 59. It's a serialized novel, so when he started writing, I think a little bit of a question. It is serialized in newspapers, so it's meant for a kind of audience that is reading newspapers. It is not combined into a book until the 1970s, so that the cover that you see here is from the 1970s. And it's never completed. We don't actually know how the story ended. We don't have a copy of the end of the story. But in the story in itself, there is a kind of historical recovery, because the plot of the story has the character Blake going to previous places where African Americans had been in plots or actually rebelled in the United States, like the place where than Montversity, right? Like, whenever he goes, the Black people are there, they're waiting for him. Like they haven't given up the struggle. So in some ways, the speculative nature of the novel calls the reader's attention to the fact, the Black people have imagined freedom, they have worked towards it, they have died to achieve it, even before these sort of white abolitionist narrative that you're hearing all the time right now had any strength, had any traction, had any sort of popular support. When we think about Blake as a figure, and this is the cover in the modern novel that you get on Amazon if you wanted to find it. The prose here is calling our attention, as many Afrofuturist prose do, like Octavia Butler did, to questions of hierarchy, questions of power, questions of the nature of coercion. And this little snippet of a of a passage, the kernel of the character that actually sells Blake's wife, and prompting his journey toward trying to find her, trying to save her, trying to end her suffering. The master is justifiable in enforcing the obedience to his will. Deny him this, and you at once deprive him the right to hold a slave. The one is necessary consequence of the other, right? So right away, we should think about what is Martin R. Delaney trying to do as a writer, as an activist, as a politician, as someone who's dedicated himself to the uplift of Black people and ensuring their freedom. In the speculative work, he revisits this history, and he is very critical, very, very deliberate in his attack on the nature of slavery. So there are stories that we tell in the context of the American mind around power, around identity, and Black speculative practice is always in the background, I would argue, and we can recover it if we choose to, and we can see the sort of complexities around this as a practice that's important to how the United States sort of arrives at its contemporary moment. Remember, as I said at the very beginning, Afrofuturism is not just simply about the future, it's also about the past, and it's also about the present. So again, let's think about this through a little clip.
1938, 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. President Roosevelt spoke to the remaining few Civil War veterans.
Veterans of the blue and the gray, on behalf of the people of the United States, I accept this monument in the spirit of brotherhood and peace.
Year after year, the nation remembered. In 1930, veterans of the Union Army marched in Cincinnati, Ohio. 4 years later, in New York City, they and the surviving veterans of the Confederacy were the last link with the terrible conflict that tore America apart from 1861 to 1865. The last Civil War veteran would die in 1959, and no longer would there be living memories of long ago battles, only history and legends. 19.
So that little clip, again from the Civil War, calls our attention to this idea that there is already in the American experience counter storytelling that can be quite powerful. We live with the consequences of this because the lost cause narrative of the Civil War, the lost cause narrative of slavery, is a counter storytelling narrative. Like we all experience the consequences of this and recognize its damaging effects, right? So the history of the Civil War and its consequences are quite clear. The stories that we tell about the Civil War and the history of its consequences are not that clear, right? So the lost cause narrative is a counter storytelling narrative that is formulated around the idea that we don't want the actual history of the Civil War to be the thing that shapes our society. Edward Pollard, who was the editor of the Richmond Examiner during the war, creates a counter story about the economic, social, and racial consequences and origins of the war that is imbibed and celebrated and at some level continues to control our political landscape. And one of the things that you can argue about a contemporary moment is that we're really attacking that counter narrative. And I would argue that you could think about Afrofuturism as a counter storytelling tool that is deliberately intervening and intersecting and dismantling this already established counter storytelling narrative, right? Um, I mean, I thought about this for a long time, and like I debated what I was going to show you this, but like I've created my own sort of like kind of storytelling narratives about the lost cause. Like I had a project called Plantation and Whip, which is really just sort of a personal art project where I just sort of made up an illustrated magazine of Southern culture that dealt with things like the lost cause, but sort of told it not in a winky sort of winky avoiding way, but like really deliberate. This is what Southerners are actually thinking, right? And the reason I call it Plantation and Whip is because there's this Southern magazine called Garden and Gun. And my first reaction when I saw that magazine was, if you called it Plantation and Whip, would you be okay with it? And most people always go, no, Julian, I would not be okay with that. And that's why I created this little visual tick around that idea. I am thinking about this question of community, this question of counter storytelling, this question of identity through multiple kinds of frameworks. And I look to Afrofuturists like my colleague, Curator Brooks is one of the people in Voice of the Black Imaginary, which is an oral history project around Afrofuturism. And she talks about Afrofuturism very, very deliberately as a theory of time. And as I say, like when we think about the nature of these narratives, these Afrofuturist narrative, we can recover them, but they connect at some level to very particular moments of time, place, identity, community, and power. So as we go and back and look and find these stories, we can find people like Sutton Griggs, who is writing in the 1890s at the height of the sort of revisionist counter storytelling associated with the rise of white supremacy and Jim Crow. And he is writing in opposition to that, right? So his story, Imperium in Imperio, is the story of a secret Black society in Texas that is planning to basically overthrow the government and create a Black state. The nature of this tale is in part a response to the anti-white theories that are going to get you things like Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which opens the way to Jim Crow segregation, like sort of legal Jim Crow segregation. But also he's writing to a Black audience, telling them very seriously to think about the nature of the socially constructed world that's being created in your midst and working against it. And this is something that is read by Black people, but for the most part, as we look back in terms of the archive, ignored by white people. Like you see notices like this in the Richmond newspaper, a new novel by Sutton Griggs, a sociological story of the Negro race problem by one of the race, interestingly written and instructive. It's an attempt on the part of an African American in the midst of a dynamic changing moment to speculate, to offer up a different framework. And it's powerful when we think about it in the context of this longer tradition of Black speculative practice. Now, I want to make sure I connect some of these questions to the broader challenges of visual culture. And again, comics have a legacy of being part of a kind of modernity in the American experience. So when we think about the placement of Black people in our visual culture, especially as we think about this in the context of the 19th century and moving forward, it is very much connected to efforts on the part of white people to marginalize Black people in print and in visual culture. It's stereotypes that are connected to slavery that persist well after slavery's end as we move into a consumer industrial culture. And so something like this, which was early in the 19th century, would put a lot of emphasis on the sort of Sambo stereotype that was used to describe African Americans, doesn't really go away. It, in fact, gets incorporated into the broader set of ethnic and racial stereotypes that is part and parcel of the rise of comic culture, the visual narrative of comics that you see in illustrated pieces in the 19th century and moving into newspaper comic strips of the 20th century. It's all these things that marginalize all non-white people. As I mentioned, no doubt before, remember, most people walking around the United States were not white in the 19th century. They were something else. To be white, you needed to be Anglo-Saxon, and that meant you had to be from a certain part of England, and that is the island of England, Britain, and a certain part of Germany to be white. Everybody else Everybody else was not white. And of course, it sucks to be black because you're at the bottom, but everybody else, Poles, Swedes, Czechs, Roma, all of that, you're somewhere on a racial hierarchy. That, again, a kind of scientific racism, which is, again, one of the consequences of the end of slavery, right? Slavery was a legal definition that said black people were lesser than white people. After slavery is no longer legal, scientific racism swoops in to provide a scientific reason why non-white people are less than white people, right? And the whiteness is defined very narrowly. And so you can see this in the visual culture of the United States. There are moments, though, always in comics where we can recover, I think, some really complicated expressions of speculation and challenge and transformation. This is Crazy Cat, which is by George Harriman. And Harriman, we know now through great work, was a mixed race man. He was a Creole from New Orleans, right? So we now read Crazy Cat, that long-running, very successful cartoon, as a racial allegory that speaks to this question of creolization and the mixed nature of the heritage of the French, Spanish sort of like racial landscape in the New World versus the sort of British racial landscape of the New World, with the British with their emphasis on the one drop rule, where both Spanish and French experiences have these sort of legal definitions, these identities, these spaces that are mixed and are accepted as a part of that landscape, right? So is in this way, can we read Crazy Cat as Crazy Cat, the black cat is a black person, the white mouse and pup and all these things as these kind of racial allegories. It's an important thing that we do, but again, this is an example of a possible recovery, right? This idea that Harriman is a mixed race person is not an old idea. This is relatively new research in the narrative of our visual culture. And so we can read Crazy Cat as part of a longer tradition of transformation related visual culture. As we go further into the 20th century and we get things like Torchy Brown, we see that African Americans, especially in African American spaces, are trying to tell different stories that are more affirmative, stories that are more, quote unquote, normalized to a kind of American experience. And Jackie Orms is, again, one of these people who, as scholars and researchers about comics and culture, that we can point to. And again, I want to show you a little bit of a clip here about her in case you don't know who she is.
In the studio of Jackie Orms, one of the few women cartoonists, the popular comic strip characters of Torchy and Heartbeat and Patty Joe literally spring to life. Syndicated in scores of newspapers, her cartoons reach more than 1 million readers each week. Fashion-minded youngsters especially like Torchy Togs, the cutout section of the comics. Jackie has received many awards for her creations that have developed into many interesting sidelines. Probably the most famous is the Patty Joe doll. One of the nation's first, Patty Joe is known and favored in America as the ideal Negro-type doll, a cute playmate that's brought happiness to many a youngster.
So Jackie Orms' work appears in Black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier, and her emphasis on her Black female character as a sophisticated, like a modern urban Black woman who's concerned with things like romance, concerned with things like fashion. Like this is an example of those Torchy Togs where you could cut out and like put these different outfits on the character. Even her decision to have a doll. Remember the difficulty for African Americans in the 1950s, this is a newspaper strip from the 1950s, to find positive depictions of themselves in popular culture. To find that was very difficult. And one of the benchmarks of the Brown versus Board of Education decision was the sociological work done by psychologists showing the damaging nature of lack of positive depictions on African American youth. And they did the doll test, right? Very famously, they gave African American children a chance of a choice of a black doll, a white doll. And they would always pick the white doll because society had taught them that the black doll or blackness was bad. And so in comics created by Black people, there's a counter storytelling narrative to the mainstream being articulated, right? And it is positive. And this is growing from the moment of political activism where Black and white allies are championing civil rights and a kind of racial progressivism. And so when we think about the sort of comic culture of the mid-century, we see African Americans being depicted in more normalized ways as the comic culture is transformed. In the post-war period, the romance genre was one of the explosive new genres that came out as superheroes declined in popularity and the comic book stands were looking for new genres. The romance was one of them, and Fawcett Comic did publish 3 issues of Negro Romance, which if you read any romance comic from this period, it's the same story, just slightly different details. Girl brokenhearted, some sort of tragedy, eventually they get married, which is the narrative of almost all sort of domestic containment of the post-World War II period being funneled to all Americans, Black and white, about domesticity and the importance of sort of living the American dream to prove that the United States was superior to our competitors, our ideological competitors, Russia. So to see Fawcett create a comic book like this, of course, is incredibly meaningful in the context of like that lack of normality being attached to Black images in comics in the visual culture of the United States. And these messages are by default, I think, arguably a kind of progressive message being offered to the comic reader. Some of these things are also very direct. Fawcett also produced a Jackie Robinson comic that, again, told the story of Jackie Robinson in a racially progressive way. This is a narrative that could appeal to white and Black people. The panels like this, where you see Jackie sort of like experience as being a baseball player, telling his story of desegregating baseball, are presented in a way to emphasize that Black and white Americans can work together in a racially progressive way. That this was an important part of the politics of civil rights from the broader American context in a global stage. Like the fact that we were this was a Jim Crow country, was problematic for the United States on the global field. And comics like this were part of an effort on the part of at least racial liberals to emphasize that prejudice and racism was un-American, right? And telling the story of Jackie Robinson, who in many ways is for white viewers was a model African American, was also signaling to the white reader that they could overcome some of the more regressive elements of their upbringing and the racism of the United States. This little two panels here. The manager is a Southerner, and he leaps to Jackie's defense as Jackie is dealing with the struggle of being a Black player and in the South as he's going through in the minor leagues as he's working his way up. And this is a real history. We know that Jackie Robinson played minor league games in places in the South where he was not allowed to be in the same hotel as his teammates, and there were rules that say he couldn't play on the field. And overcoming that was one of the sort of signature parts of his story of success in terms of like racial egalitarianism of the post-war period. Another really famous example of comics sort of telling us sort of pro-social story is the Martin Luther King and Montgomery story. This is a comic book that was created specifically to tell the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. If you can download this online, and it tells that story brilliantly, but again, does so in a way that sort of emphasizes that kind of racial egalitarianism that's very important. But again, you can see here there are examples of comics being able to tell more positive stories at a moment where the broader narrative of the print culture in the United States is not willing to tell these stories. And these singular examples shouldn't be ignored. But on the other hand, I think it's often important to recognize that the nature of these examples are really in conversation with the grassroots efforts of African Americans to do this work, right? Like the reason you have the Montgomery bus boycott comic is because they had the Montgomery bus boycott. And telling that story in a way that's accessible to other people is the reason that the comic was created. And indeed, very famously, this comic was something that the late Representative John Lewis read and inspired him to get into civil rights. And of course, later in life, John Lewis created his own comic book series telling his story of civil rights called March, a 3-volume series where he tells his story of civil rights activism. Are they telling these stories in more popular landscapes, right? Jackie Orms is I would argue, a very popular newspaper comic strip designed for an audience to be entertaining. Its presence in the public sphere, creating a different sort of pathway for people to think about the depictions of Blackness. Very important. Another comic book publisher who is doing this is also EC Comics. Very famously, they have a comic book story called Judgment Day, where the idea of racial segregation is handled in a kind of allegory using blue and orange robots. And the end of this story, you find out that the representative from the Galactic Federation that is touring this robot world is Black. You don't know this until the very end. But this is a very controversial story in the sense that it's very shocking, got a lot of positive appeal, but we point to it as an example of a kind of socially conscious storytelling in comics. And I would advocate that you read Kiana Whittick's great book on EC Comics that you can get through our library if you want to know more about the preachies, the kind of stories, these sort of socially minded stories that EC produced. Naturally, Black Panther fits into this canon as an important figure as a superhero. Not the first African American superhero, but the first Black superhero character in comics, right? This is the origin of so much related to our thinking about Afrofuturism and comics. For years, we've written about Black Panther as an Afrofuturist character. I'm sure if you've ever seen me give a talk about Black Panther, I've mentioned him as an Afrofuturist character. This is a character created by 2 Jewish creators, but in that character, they acknowledge this kind of post-colonial reality, like what would happen, what might have happened if white people had not exploited, destroyed, and had an imperial experience in Africa. The premise alone sparks these different pathways of consideration, and it's important to recognize it as such. So the Black Panther character appears in 2 issues of Fantastic Four. This panel on the left is at the end of that story in Fantastic Four. He dedicates himself to being a hero like any other. This is in 1966. By 1968, the Black Panther is an Avenger in good standing, and we follow his adventures in the Avenger and later on in the 1970s in a title called Jungle Action, where they boot out the sort of Tarzan analog and use Black Panther to tell some classic stories. But this is beginning at some level of like this really clear in the minds of many people Afrofuturist strain in comics. And it's worth noting, as I say, when we think about these things in the relation to this broader landscape of comics and identity, that this does not happen in a vacuum. There's complexity here. So what does this mean in the context, these questions of community, in the context of Beyond the Black Panther? Well, community is one of the themes, and we do this in the context of, not surprisingly, a comic adaptation of Octavia Butler novel. Parable of the Power of the Sower is a adaptation by Damian Duffy and John Jennings of Octavia Butler's classic novel, right? So this is one of the really very dead on Afrofuturist work that if you read it today, it would seem like it is literally describing the world outside, right down in that original novel to a president whose slogan is "Make America Great Again." In adapting this story, Jennings and Duffy are, as they say, mining the work of Butler, who, remember, as I said at the very beginning, is very concerned with that human contradiction. How can you have intelligence and hierarchy? And her characters, especially the character in Parable of the Sower and the sequel Parable of the Talents, um, the lead character comes up with a philosophy that doesn't make the mistake of real society, right? Like it's a philosophy. Earthseed is a philosophy designed to get around these questions of hierarchy, to get around these questions of exploitation, to get around these things, right? Like create it in the context of a kind of dystopian future that looks and feels very much like the world we live in today. And so it makes perfect sense to me that we would include this in a consideration of community, in part because of like the way that the foundational elements of Afrofuturism are often linked to Octavia Butler and her concern with structure, her concern with community, her concern with liberation and protection being so central. Another sort of example here is I Am Afonso Jones, which is a novel sort of drawn by Stacey Robinson and written by Tony Medina. This is often referred to as a Black Lives Matters graphic novel. The lead character is a young man who is murdered, and you can see in this panel on the bottom that he wakes up on a subway train with bullet holes, and he's led through his life and meets other African Americans who are unjustly murdered by the police as part of this story. And again, when we think about the contemporary moment, the importance of comic panels capturing the sort of really what has been for many years desperate public engagement around police brutality and any Black policies in American society, and now in the context of the pandemic with the protests last summer with George Floyd, when you see the panel like you do on the left here, which is drawn directly from I Am Afonso Jones, this is the comic and reality being in very tight dialogue, but the goals of both the activism on the street and the comic itself is to sort of capture this need for protection, this emphasis on community that's so important to our contemporary political and social context. So there's a way, hopefully, that we can see these comic works as eliciting different pathways to consider how we can have a community that's safer, healthier, and one that will promote the ideas that are so central to the American experience. So I'm going to stop droning on, and hopefully that all made a little bit of sense. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chambliss. That was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to hearing people's questions. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can put them in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll look forward to hearing what you'd like to ask today.
No questions. Oh.
We always need to give people time to talk or time to type. Okay, we have a question. Speaking of the future, are there any particular cultural productions you're most excited about forthcoming in the next 5 years?
I think like a lot of people, I'm interested in seeing what Black Panther 2 is going to look like. I actually think that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. I think it's impossible to at some level, almost impossible to match the kind of like cultural impact of Black Panther 1. And I actually think that that challenge will be fraught with a lot of concern for Ryan Coogler and his team. I actually believe that there are a lot of opportunities in the Disney Plus space for them to expand on the mythology of Wakanda. And so I know that they're developing shows that might be on Disney Plus that are produced by Ryan Coogler. And I'm really interested in seeing what those are. I think that's important. I also think that there are a lot of people developing new media projects based on comic books like Bitterroot. That is a really great comic, and a lot of work that has been produced by Black comic book creators is getting a lot of attention, in part because of the political moment that we're in, and because we have this really dynamic streaming landscape now. So I don't know where all those are in terms of development, but I have no doubt that many of these things will see the light of day in different platforms. It'll be interesting to see how people being exposed to this work will shape like a new generation of creatives and new sort of artistic narratives.
Thank you. Any other questions? And this has been so interesting today. I loved seeing the historical thread running throughout this. I took several screenshots of some of the comics from the 40s and 50s. Can you just tell us, how can we access those? Are things like that publicly available?
Sure. If you're looking for specific comics, of course, you can always go to the MSU library, and you can go in the reading room and they will bring those comics to you. So if you saw a comic like, oh, I want to see that Negro comics from Fawcett, we have that. You can read it in the reading room. Like, hopefully when the pandemic is over, we'll have more regular hours, but you can sort of pull it from there. If you want to read the Montgomery bus boycott comic, you can actually download that. It is freely available on the internet. There are actually quite a few of them. You can get anything on the internet. It's just a question of how many laws you want to break, right? So you can get all of this on the internet. But that one in particular is actually in the public domain. So you can download it from different places.
That's good news.
I would say that if you want to read things like EC Comics, those are, again, things that you can check out for the library. Many public libraries today have really robust comic book collections, and thankfully, because of publishers putting out showcase editions and collected editions, you can get a lot of these stories from places like EC. They're in your local library. So if you got a library card, you can pop down to the library, your local library, and see what they have. And if they don't have it at their local branch, they probably have it in the system, and you can interlibrary loan it, and you can read it. Of course, you can always come to MSU's library, and if you're a student, and the special collection, anyone can go in and make an appointment right now. You have to do it by appointment, but you can come in and use our finding aid and find these comics like Black Panther, First Appearance, and Fantastic Four, or Jungle Action and things like that. You can find all of those. And so many of these comics are available through different means. Even Judgment Day, that story has been scanned by people. And if you Google it, Judgment Day, EC Comics, you can find pretty much the whole story online if you want to read it.
We do have another question. Wondering where people can read your books.
Well, you can go on my website, julianchambliss.com, and you can find my work on comics, and a lot of my work is digital, so you can actually just go to the website. Like Beyond the Black Panther is a big digital thing, right? Like I have a pattern of doing that. I have actually a lot of talks and lectures that you can find on my website. And so if you're interested, julianchambliss.com. I try to keep it simple, and just click on the bottom link where it says scholarly, and you see all the academic stuff.
Great. Good to know. Any other questions? Okay, well, we thank you so much for being here. We do have a poll that we'd like, if you have just a second, to answer a couple of questions. And again, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And thank you to Dr. Chambliss for this great talk, and wish you a good rest of your day.